I'm Kerry Kingston and I'll be guiding you through these Alias automotive tutorials. And I've been working with two car design graduates on this course, Sam and Mike, and I'll be using their 3D Alias models as examples for the tutorials. And the reason I'm using two models is that the Alias software can be used at various stages of the design process. And it makes it much easier for me to be able to teach the tools if I can be clear about what part of the process they apply to. So I'm using Sam's model as a representation of the concept modelling process, starting with sketches, and Mike's as a representation of a more detailed, higher surface quality model that starts out as a polygon mesh. And this first section of the tutorials, the interface fundamentals, covers the basic driving skills you'll need to be fluent with the Alias interface. So I'll use Sam's and Mike's car models as examples, and get you to view them, assemble them, organise them, and shade them up. And then in later tutorials you'll learn how to build your own curves and surfaces to create a design similar to Mike's car. But if you're a complete beginner, then you may also want to have a look at the essential skills videos from the Alias help menu. But the best way to learn is just to relax and have some fun. So I hope the videos will inspire you to explore Alias and spend some time developing your skills so that it becomes a natural working environment to begin creating your own designs in. So take a look at these first tutorials, which assume you're a complete beginner and get you started from scratch. Hi, it's Kerry here, and I'll get started with the tutorials by double-clicking on the Alias icon to open the software. And if it's the first time you've opened Alias, you'll get this screen, and I recommend that you choose the default workflow. So you might want to select Don't Show Again, and then choose Default. And this default will give you access to all of the Alias tools, and it's the one I'll be using in these tutorials. So now that we're into Alias, let's get a car model to look at. So I'll do a File Open, and it takes you to the default location here. Now I'm using a PC, but if you're on a Mac then the path should be similar. But I just want to take a moment now to look at the Alias file system. And the important directory here is user_data. And when you first use Alias, there's only two directories in here. The dumpster, which is a legacy file that we don't use anymore, so we can ignore it. And demo, which is just an empty starter project, which contains subdirectories for all the different types of data you may create on a project. And again, these are all empty to start with. Now, don't be put off by this long list, because there's only two key directories that we'll be using. The first one is the wire directory, which holds all your geometry. That's wireframe geometry, as well as any shaders or colours we've used. And it also stores some construction settings used to specify, for example, the units used and the accuracy that the model is built to. Now we cover this properly in later tutorials, but it comes up when we open a file, so I wanted to just mention it now. The second one is the Pix directory, and this can hold reference sketches, texture maps, and screen grabs and renders that we might create. Now if you've downloaded all the tutorial files, then you need to add them to your user data directory. And then you'll see the full list of projects that we'll be using. And in your professional work, this will be populated with the design projects that you're working on. And finally, Alias has this concept of a current project, which you use to set the default directory for where you want to store your design data. So that's what we'll do first. So if I now go back to Alias and click back up to user data, and you can see that I've got the demo project, the dumpster, and all the tutorial projects. So if I select the Fundamentals 1 project, and then come down here and click on Set Current, then that takes me into the wire directory of that project, which will now be the default path. So now I can open up this first tutorial model, which is Sam's concept car. And I'll be asked if I want to clear my previous model, which is just this empty grid and scene, so I'll answer yes. And then I get the question about those construction options I mentioned. And we don't need to look at these in detail yet, just accept the new settings that come with the new model you're opening. And then we can see Sam's design concept model. Now up here on the top right we've got the standard Autodesk view cube, and I just need to click and drag on it to tumble the model. And I can switch to a top view by clicking on this face, or to a left view, or a front view. And then I can just click and drag again. And there are also 3/4 and 45-degree views that you can click on as well. Now, to make this a bit more fun to look at, you can shade up the car using this Vis1 shader. And that applies the colours that Sam has already set up on his model. And if you want to, you can also use this show button at the top of the window to turn off the model, which is the wireframe display. And you can also turn off the grid as well if you want to. But be careful with this if you then turn the shading off using this icon here, because it then looks like everything's disappeared. And if that ever happens, just check on the show button whether your model's turned off or not, and just turn it back on again. So to get started, just download the tutorial files and put them in user data, set the current project, open the file, and then just get the hang of tumbling and shading the model. So I'm still working on the file from the first tutorial, where you saw how you could tumble the model using the view cube. But now I want to get you zooming and panning the model as well as just tumbling. Now you can continue to work with a shaded view using the Vis1 shader if you like, but I'm going to turn that off and instead use a hidden line view from the window display menu. And it's just an alternative way of visualizing the wireframe. Now to view the model with more control, you need to hold the Shift and Alt keys down together and keep them held down and use one of the 3 mouse buttons. And the left mouse tumbles, the middle mouse button pans the view, and the right mouse zooms the view. And with zooming, we click and drag the mouse in this diagonal to get a really responsive zoom in and zoom out. So for example, if I try to move it in this direction instead, I get a jittery result, because in fact Alias is reading these small diagonal movements from the bottom left to the top right. Now when I tumble, you might have noticed this coloured triad here, and this is called the point of interest. It represents the centre of the tumbling. And I can change it by holding down the Shift and the Alt, and then clicking on a different piece of geometry like this wheel. Just click and let go. And then when you click again to tumble, it's now centred on your new point of interest. Now when you hold down the Shift and Alt keys, you also get this menu that appears under the view cube. And this has useful tools like return to the previous view. And then down at the bottom we've got a way to bookmark a view and save it, so that when I move the view, I can always go back to that bookmarked view. And up at the top is a tool called Look At. And Look At brings all the geometry into the view, and it's similar to framing in other software. But Look At works best when you combine it with picking objects. So if I go over to the palette and use Pick Object, I can click on this front wheel, for example, to select it, and it gets highlighted in white. So now if I do a Look At, then it's the wheel that gets framed in the view. And now, even if I do a Pick Nothing to deselect the wheel, it's still framed. But what also happens with Look At is that the zooming and tumbling get adjusted to suit the size of the wheel. And this is something you'll get a feel for when you work with it, and it's really useful. So let's try again on the small badge at the front of the car. So I'll use Pick Object again, and here we get a thing called the Pick Chooser. And I just need to keep my mouse held down and move between the choices till I get the one I want. So if I do a Look At now, it will frame the badge and also make the tumbling and zooming really responsive to this small size of geometry. So a big movement on the screen only results in a small movement around the badge. But if I now try to zoom out back to the whole car, then it's just too slow and I'm having to do lots of mouse movements. So the solution is to go back to the palette and do a Pick Nothing to make sure nothing is selected. And so then doing a Look At will apply to all the geometry and readjust the view back to the full car size again. And finally, there's also a view palette, which we don't use much, but it has its own look at tool. And this is useful because it has a hotkey, which you can see if you use the right-hand mouse key on the tab title to access the text version of the palette tools. So if you like using hotkeys, then Alt-L is a really useful one. So to help you practice these tools, I've added a tip sheet into the file, which you can see if you use Object Display Visible. And this is just a canvas image, which we'd normally use for sketching. But I'm just using it here as an aide-memoire whilst you learn the keyboard and mouse keys. And you can turn it on and off using the Show menu, and just by choosing Canvas Planes. Alternatively, you can use the quick tips on the website, which list all the key combinations used in Alias, and starts with this Shift and Alt keys for viewing. So keep working on Sam's car to practice the viewing, and you might want to choose a hidden line display instead of the Vis one. If you want to see the tips page, then use Object Display Visible, and just practice using those Shift and Alt keys along with the 3 mouse buttons until it starts to become a more natural way of interacting with the model. So Sam's model already has some layers set up, and we can see those by opening up the Windows Object Lister, which lists all the layers in this floating window. Now these work in a similar way to Photoshop and other systems, so I can turn the layers on and off using this small square icon. And I can also use it to change the layer colour by clicking and holding until the colour menu appears, and then just choosing the colour I want for the wireframe. And this can make it easier to distinguish each layer. And I can always go back to the default colours by choosing None. So what you need to know now is how to create your own set of layers for models that you build. And for this, I'm going to open up the second training model, which is called Mike's Development Car. And I'll say yes to delete Sam's car as I haven't made any changes that need saving. And you can see here in the object lister that it only has a default layer, which is always there in every project. So let's create some new layers. And for this, I'll use the right mouse button on the layer to get the submenu, and just choose Insert New Layer. And this gives me a new layer with a default name, which I can double click on to rename, and I'll call it Bodywork. And I'll do that again to get a second layer, and I'll call this one Glass. So the next step is to assign the geometry. So I can use Pick Object, and you'll see that the surfaces have already been grouped, which is something we'll cover in a later tutorial. So I can select the bodywork surfaces and then use the right-hand mouse key again to say Assign, to put that geometry onto the layer. And I'll normally check that it's worked by turning the layer on and off. Alternatively, if I open up the layer, I can see the body group inside. So then I can use Pick Object again to choose the glass elements and assign all of those to the glass layer. And then I think I need another layer for the remaining bits, which I'll just call Trim. And you can see that it's much easier to pick the remaining geometry with the other layers turned off. So having organised my layers, I can now do some really useful stuff with them, like manage symmetry. You can see that Mike's model is just one half of the design. But I can use the layers to display the mirrored geometry, either selecting Symmetry from the Layer submenu, or using this shortcut icon here. And the mirrored geometry is displayed as a dashed line to distinguish between the original and the mirrored side. Now we were lucky here that the default symmetry direction was along the centre line of our car. If we wanted a different direction for a different design, then we first need to select the layer by clicking on it, and then use Layers, Symmetry, Set Plane, and choose one of the other symmetry directions shown on these small brown squares. And then if I hit set plane, you can see that now it's mirrored across the front axle instead of the center line of the car. So I'll just return that back to the correct direction. And let's finish up by looking at one way in which we can make use of this layer organization that we've set up. If I go over to the diagnostic shading and use the Vis1 shader, you'll see that Mike hasn't set up any colors. And Vis1 uses rendering shaders, which I'm not going to cover in these tutorials. But we do have access to the multicolor shader here, which allows us to create some very basic color schemes. So now I can use the layer submenu to pick all the objects that are on that layer so that they're selected. So now when I pick on the color chip, I can select a color to apply to all the bodywork. So I'll just choose a reddish color here. And I can do the same for the objects on the glass layer. I can select those and choose a different color. So I'll just go for a darkish bluish black. And finally, I can pick the object on the trim layer and I'll just make those black. And it doesn't mean that you can't still just use pick object to pick single parts to have as different colors. Now I'm going to save the file because I've got the layers and colors nicely set up now. And I'll be using this model in the next tutorials. So I'll just do a save as, and I'm going to give it a different name. Just add my initials on the end so that I keep the original file unchanged. So your task for this tutorial is to open up Mike's car design, create some layers and assign the geometry, use the symmetry to display both sides of the car, and then use the multicolor shader to give the car some color. And don't forget to save the file at the end so that you can use it in later tutorials. In this tutorial, I'm going to look at some more things we can do with the object lister. So what our model is missing is some wheels, and I've provided a wheel model for you to import. But before I do that, I'm going to tidy up the workspace a bit. So I'll take the shading off, and I'll turn off the car layers so that I'll be able to see the wheel clearly when it comes in. And I can also minimize these windows using the small arrow. So now on my file menu, instead of doing an open, which would delete the car model, I'll do an import. And I'll just choose import file. And here's my wheel model, which I'll open. So I can now frame that into the view by doing a look at. So if I use pick object to select all the surfaces, and then hold my Shift and Alt keys down, I can choose the look at option. Now if I open up the object lister, it looks like it's come in already on a layer, which is great. But if I open up that layer, I've just got a long list of surfaces. And if I use pick object, it isn't conveniently grouped together like the car model was. So we can sort that out with groups. So let's see what the shading's like. So we haven't got any colors set up. So we can use groups to set those colors up as an alternative to the way we used layers in the previous tutorial. Now creating groups create new entities. And whenever I create something new, it goes onto the active layer, which is the one shown in yellow. So I'll select this layer now so that it becomes the active layer. And then to create the groups, I'll use pick object, and I'll start with the tire surfaces because they're easy to select. And then I'll say edit group. And that means now if I do a pick nothing and then a pick object again, the two tire surfaces get selected as a single object. Now this is quite hard to find in this long list of surfaces, but I can use these arrows up here to jump to the selected group, and you may need to click it a couple of times. And here's the group node, which I can now double click to rename, so I'll call it tire. And I can use this orange cube icon to make it invisible, or back to visible again. And this is the same as the tools up here on the object display menu, visible and invisible, just exactly the same. So I've got the rest of the surfaces to sort out, and I'm going to choose the hub next as that looks like the easiest part to select. So I'm still in pick object, so I'll carefully do a drag select, and then try and get the rest of the surfaces down here. Now selecting with the left mouse button toggles, so if I drag select again there's a danger I might deselect some surfaces, and this can be tricky to see, so I'm just going to shade the ones I've picked to check, and I'll use this orangey colour. And it looks like I've missed this middle surface, so I'll just pick that now and shade it again to make sure that I've got the surfaces that I wanted. So now I've got the right ones, I can do an edit group again. And then use the arrow to find the node in the object lister and just rename it. So I'll do a pick nothing to make sure that nothing is left selected. And now, even though this is the most complex set of surfaces, it's easy to drag select them, and that's why I left it till last. And I've got an alternative way of grouping that I can use, which is to use the right mouse key and choose Group from the submenu. It's exactly the same as using Group from the Edit menu. So I can now see that easily, and I'll just call that the wheel. And I'll give this another colour. So if I now want to make all the components visible again, I could select the orange cubes individually here, or I can just go up to the Object Display menu and do Visible, which makes everything visible in one go. So finally, I can bring all these components together and create a hierarchy of groups by selecting all three of them and saying Group again. And that creates a new node that has the subcomponents within it. So I'll call that Mike's wheel. So this makes it easier to pick the whole wheel with just one click when I want to copy and move and rotate it into the 4 positions within the car. But I can still always select the individual components from the object lister here. So let's see where the wheel sits within the car by making the other layers visible. And it looks about the right size, but it's in the wrong place from this front view. It's in the centre, but from the side view it looks about right. So in the next tutorial we'll get the wheels positioned properly. But for now I'll just save it and I'll call it KK2. So being able to select confidently, group objects and work with the object lister are fundamental tools for working with Alias. So use this wheel as an opportunity to practice those skills, and then in the next tutorial we'll be able to complete the car by getting all 4 wheels into place. I'm going to start moving, rotating and scaling the geometry in the XYZ directions. And I'll start by getting this first wheel into the right position. So I'll use Pick Object, and you can see now how the grouping and naming has made it really easy to select the wheel. So now I can use the Transform palette where I have the Move tool. And this uses the 3 mouse buttons to move in the 3 XYZ directions, shown here in the RGB triad. So to move this wheel out to the side, I use the middle mouse button to drag it in the Y direction. And I can tumble the view if I want to get a better view, and just keep dragging till I get it roughly in the right position. Now I need a second wheel for the rear, so with my front wheel still selected I can do an Edit, Copy, or just use the hotkey Ctrl+C. And then I'll do a Paste. And to start with it's difficult to see what's happened, but a second wheel has been placed at the same location as the first, and it's left highlighted. So the Move tool is still active, and as the wheel is already selected, when I start to move it in the X direction, it's better to come out into a spare bit of space and just click and drag with that first mouse button. And I'll just get it into position by eye. But I need to be careful in this side view. If I go over to the View cube here and click on Left, you'll see that it now says Orthographic. And this means we've gone into a true 2D view, and the mouse buttons work differently. In 3D they are X, Y and Z, but in the 2D view they are free, horizontal and vertical. So if I use the first mouse button that was X in 3D, here it's now free movement. So I'll just do an edit undo or Control Z here to get it back again. So in this view, it'll be the middle mouse button that I want to use to move it horizontally into a good position. And we'll cover these different mouse constraints in much more detail in the next section. But for now, I recommend that you just work with X, Y, Z in the perspective view. So I'll just do a pick object now on the front wheel to make sure both are selected. And now I can use scale to modify the size. So I'll click and drag again in a spare bit of screen. And you can see that I'm using the same diagonal as I do for zooming, to say bigger or smaller. And one of the benefits of having grouped the wheels in the previous tutorial is that all the components have the same pivot position, and so scale around the same point. So I'll do a pick nothing and then pick object again to just select the front wheel. And now I'll look at rotating it in X, Y, and Z. So the middle mouse button rotates it in Y, in the direction it would revolve, centered on that green pivot point. And if I wanted to turn the wheels, that would be the Z direction. So I can use the right mouse button to do that. So I've got 2 of the 4 wheels now. And I've got a few options to get the other 2. I could use the object lister and the symmetry on layers to display a mirror image. But because I've rotated the front wheel, it doesn't give me the right result. So in this case, I'll take the symmetry off and create a separate mirrored copy instead. And to do that, I need to think of where the mirror plane would be and be able to describe it in X, Y, and Z. So I want these 2 wheels to be copied over to the other side. So if I visualize the plane, then that will be an X, Z mirror plane. So first I need to pick the 2 wheels and then go to Edit, Duplicate, Mirror. And I need to go into this small square to open the option window. And now I can choose the right plane, which will be the XZ. And that now creates 2 new independent wheels. And I can do a pick nothing and a pick object again to select the front wheel, and then rotate it again to get it roughly in line with the other front wheel. Now we've been working interactively here. We'll cover working accurately with dimensions in a later tutorial. So to finish off this section, let's do a pick nothing and go and shade the car. And to make it a bit more interesting, down at the bottom of the shading panel, I can turn on reflections. And I've got a choice of scenes I can reflect to make it look a bit more realistic. So assemble the car and experiment with the colours and the reflections. And you can use the quick tips pages as a reminder if you need it. But the best thing to do is just spend time playing until the mouse keys for zooming and moving become instinctive. And this means that when we start to create our own geometry in the next section, you'll feel in control of the working environment. Here I'm going to show you 6 tips for some typical situations that might happen when you start learning Alias. And the first is managing the windows. The control panel and diagnostic shade are docked windows. And if you keep an eye on this view cube, you can see that when I minimize them, the modelling window stretches out to fill the space. And then when I open them again, the modelling window is pushed over. And what can easily happen is that you undock a window by moving it. So to redock it, you just need to hold the Shift key down and then click on the top tab and drag it over until it lines up with this outside edge, and then let go, and it's docked again. Now the palette over here starts out as a floating window, so when I minimize that, it doesn't affect the modelling window at all, as it's just floating on top of it. But I could choose to dock this window in the same way, by using the Shift key again and moving it until it lines up with the outer edge, and then it docks. And the benefit of this is that the XYZ icon down here is always visible. And you can choose to dock any of the windows or keep them as floating. It's up to you. And one other common thing is to accidentally delete one of the windows. But you can always get them back again using the menus. This tip is for a problem that can sometimes happen when you're opening files. If you have one model already in the scene, and then you do a file open and choose a replacement model, you typically want to say yes here. But if you mistakenly say no, then what you get is both files in the modelling window, but one of them is shown in green. And this green colour is the clue that stages are being used. And up here we have the Stages tab, which allows you to switch between the two files. Now, stages are useful, but as a beginner I would recommend that you avoid them. So if you ever see this green colour, then I'd recommend that you go back to the file menu and open the file again, but this time making sure that you say yes. Here is a quick fix for a small problem you sometimes get when you're using diagnostic shading. Occasionally you notice an apparent discrepancy between two surfaces. But this is just a difference in the specularity setting, and you can fix it by just moving the specularity slider a little bit. And that then resets all the surfaces to the same setting. If you like to learn independently by just exploring the interface, then make use of the Help menu. And the most useful tool is What's This?, which lets you just click on a tool to bring up the Alias help page. Alternatively, if you just hover over a tool, then a help window pops up. And you can click on this help icon to open up the same help page. But if you find these tool tips annoying, then just simply turn them off in the General Preferences section. So go to Help and then make your choice on the pop-up help. Here are some extra selection options that you can use for picking. When we were selecting surfaces in the wheel tutorial, I mentioned that the left mouse key worked as a toggle. So unpicked surfaces are selected and vice versa. And most beginners stick with just using the left mouse key to start with. But it's possible to use the other two keys as well. The middle mouse key works as an add, and the right hand mouse key works as an unpick only. Now I'll cover these gradually as the tutorials progress, but if you're impatient to start using them, then I suggest that you look at the resources section of the website, where there's a 2011 update movie called Selection Options that gives you all the information you need to get started. And finally, if you like to use hotkeys, we've seen how there are some hotkeys already set up for some of the tools, like cut, copy and paste, for example. And over on the palette, if you use the right-hand mouse key on the palette tab, you can see the hotkeys for the palette tools. To change these or modify them, you can use Preferences, Interface, Hotkeys menus, and modify either the menu or the palette tools, just by finding the tool you want and typing in the new hotkey that you want to use, and then clicking on Apply. And on the website, there's a quick tips document that takes you through the steps to customize the hotkeys.